it? Yeah, there you go.
Glad everyone could be here this evening. Please turn to the book of Micah, chapter 1, please. Book of Micah, chapter 1. Began in our last study period the introduction to the book of Micah, and we have discussed the background of the book to some extent, emphasizing that Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah during the period of the divided kingdom, when the northern nation of Israel had separated from the southern nation of Judah, and most of the prophets that we've studied so far, as far as we know, prophesied during this period, especially Hosea and Amos, prophesied to the northern kingdom, whereas Isaiah and Micah were prophesying mainly to the southern kingdom. And we'll study as we go along, in Lord willing, and other of the prophets, some who prophesied to later periods. But the theme that we had picked out, the thing that I picked out to emphasize from this book, to more or less distinguish it from some of the other books, is that God is putting on trial the people of Israel. That is to say, he is acting as a witness to testify against them, bringing the evidence of their sins, and thereby demonstrating why they're going to go into captivity if they don't correct their lives. So the first couple of chapters is God's testimony about the people's sins and the punishment that's coming. And then chapters 3 through 5, specifically, God is testifying against the leaders, the rulers of the land, and their responsibility. And then the last couple of chapters, God compares how he has tried to treat the people compared to how they've treated him. So that's pretty much what we've been talking about to this point. Now, as we look into chapter 1, the first part of the chapter has discussed the fact that punishment is coming, the sins of the people, and God pictures himself, especially in verse 2, part of what I pointed out, that God says he's a witness against them. So God we'll see, ultimately, he's the judge and the executioner, but he's also the witness. He's the one who's going to testify against them. So he comes as a witness into this trial against the people, and it describes how he comes. And what's going to happen then, he says, is that Samaria is going to be a heap of ruins. Samaria, remember, is the capital of the northern tribe. There's also going to be consequences to the southern tribe of Judah. But at first he's talking about Samaria. And then we get into the last part. That took us down through verse 9 last time. And then starting at verse 10 this evening through the end of the chapter. So that's where we are before we proceed. Any questions or discussion anybody has before we proceed? Okay, I hope you've had an exciting time studying these cities and their names in the last part of the book, or the chapter rather. We'll talk about them obviously some more as we go, but let's go ahead and read it first. So it's going to be a challenge, whoever volunteers, to read these names, verse 10 through 16. So who wants to accept the challenge, chapter 1, verses 10 through 16, to read the cities, these names of these cities? Or should I call on a volunteer? Jason volunteers, okay.
Declare ye not that Gath, weep ye not at all, the house of Abraham. Roll thyself in the dust, pass ye away, thou inhabitant of Saphir. Having thy name naked, the inhabitant of Zana came not forth in the morning of Basil. He shall receive of you his statement. For the inhabitant of Moroth waited carefully for you, but evil came down from the Lord into the gate of Jerusalem. O thou inhabitant of Lachish, bind the chariot to the swift beast. She is the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion. For the transgressions of Israel were found in thee. Therefore shalt thou give presents to Morsheth-Gath, the house of Asa shall be a lie to the kings of Israel. Yet will I bring an heir unto thee, O inhabitant of Mareshah. he shall come unto Adullam, the glory of Israel, make thee bald and pull thee for thy delicate children, enlarge thy baldness as the eagle, for they are going into captivity.
Okay. Now, in the assignment that I gave you in the book, I tried to emphasize that this is a really pretty unusual section of the minor prophets. In fact, I'm not sure that I can think of anything else that's really parallel to it. What Micah is doing here is making a play on words, on the names of these cities, at least as far as I can tell. That it's not so much a question of the location. Many of them we don't even know the location, but it's mainly the meaning of the names and the sound of the names that he is using to try to teach points ultimately about the fact that they're going to go into captivity. So, the assignment I gave you was to see if you can determine what there is about these various different names that would lead him to say the things that he says about them. But the problem, of course, we have with that is that these are in Hebrew, and we don't speak Hebrew, and so the rhyme or the meaning is not going to be obvious to us in our language. The people that he wrote to, they would no doubt have understood, at least most of them, the names, would have understood the play on words that he was trying to make or whatever. But it's harder for us. However, while we will discuss this and probably have some different viewpoints on some of these names and what they mean, the important thing is we know the point of it. Where he's going with all of it is they're going to go into captivity. They're going to be punished for their sins. They're guilty and they're going to be punished. That's what all of it means in the bottom line. It's just some specifics of what the names mean and so on. So let's talk about them, but I want to spend a lot of time on it because, as I said, we really know the main point, and probably we're going to have some different viewpoints on the specifics. Okay, maybe have any questions or comments before we try to look at these names and the significance. All right, so the first one that he gets is Gath. Verse 10, tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. Okay, so the significance of Gath, what did you find about this? Anybody? And speak right up. What did you find about Gath, and what does it have to do with why he says tell it not in Gath? Comments? I've got all these volunteers. Susie?
It sounds like the Hebrew word for tell or to declare.
Okay. All right. Okay, very good. So then that's what I found too, that the meaning of the word is to tell, but Micah says don't tell it to Gath. Any thoughts on why not? Susie?
So that they wouldn't, so that you're not exposing your shame and misery to your enemies so that they will glory over you or glory over God.
This one's a little bit easier than some of the others. Gath was one of the 5 major cities of the Philistines. And if you notice in 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 20, when King Saul died, David said, tell it not in Gath, because he didn't want the enemies to rejoice over God's people. That seems to me to be the idea here then too. That at least helps me. He says, tell it not in Gath. The word Gath means tell, but he said, don't tell it because he doesn't want the enemies to rejoice that the nation's going to fall. That's what I got out of it too. Other comments on it? Okay, that's probably the easiest one that we'll have. The next one says, weep not at all in Beth Ophrah, roll yourself in the dust. Okay? So what did you find about Beth Ophrah, or Ophrah, Terry?
That its meaning is the house of dust or mourning.
Okay, it means a house of dust. Okay, so he says, in Beth Ophrah, roll yourself in the dust. It's a house of dust, so roll yourself in the dust. So what would be the significance of that? And roll yourself in the dust, what's that? What's its significance? Terry.
The idea of sackcloth and ashes and mourning.
Okay, grief. Yes, and why would you roll in the dust? Well, it's an expression of grief. So don't tell in Gath that the people are going to go into captivity because the enemy would rejoice. Roll in the dust, mourning, grief, etc. Okay, that's pretty much what I got from it too. Anybody else have any other comments on verse 10, the two there? Okay, the next one, pass by in naked shame, you inhabitant of Shapher. Okay, Shapher. Okay, what did you find about Shapher? Any observations on that? Frank?
I found that it means delightful.
Okay. All right. Delightful or pleasant or beautiful. Those are some of the things I found too. All right. Delightful, beautiful. But instead of delight and beauty, the inhabitant is going to have naked shame. The opposite of what you would think of delight or beauty. In other words, their name is the opposite of what's really going to happen. What's going to happen is punishment. We talked about this a bit last time, where the people were going into captivity, verse 8, stripped and naked, and so on. So the idea is similar, that rather than beauty and pleasantness, there's going to be shame and loss of everything that they would enjoy. Okay? That's what I got out of it, too. Other comments on Shapher? Okay? All right. Zonan says the inhabitant of Zonan does not go out. Okay. The inhabitant of Zonan does not go out. What did you find about the meaning of Zonan that had anything to do with that? Anybody? Susie?
It means to come out. So since it sounds like come out, but they're not going to be allowed to come out because they'll be destroyed.
Okay. So that's what I got out of it too, that the idea is, the meaning of the word is to march out or to go out. And so the play on words is that's not what's going to happen. It's going to be the opposite of that. Or if you maybe want to look at it this way, they're going to march out into captivity, but they're not going to march the way they want to. They're not going to go where they want to go, but they're going to go someplace where they don't want to go. They're not going to be able to escape from the captivity. They're going to go where they don't want to go. Okay? Other comments on Zonan? Isn't this fun? Okay, rolling right along. Next one, Beth Ezel. Beth Ezel, he says, mourns. Okay? And this is probably the toughest one for me. Not at all sure about this one. So who is sure about it? No, never mind that part of the question. Who has a suggestion? Who wants to suggest something on Beth Ezel? Terry.
I don't know if this is right, because two of them that you've already had, I had different answers for. Beth, I've got a place of declivity.
Okay, so place of what?
Declivity.
That doesn't help me a whole lot.
My understanding, like a sunken in place, a declivity.
Okay. That's not what I got, but it's probably as good as what I got. Susie, what'd you have?
I found that it meant near or at your side. So if somebody's near, at your side, and now, whether this is right or not, I don't know, that perhaps it had been near another city that would expect them to help them in their trial and time of oppression, but they wouldn't be able to because they would be gone also.
Okay, and that's sort of what I found too, that the idea of a neighbor, somebody nearby, but its place, it says, to stand is taken away from you so that they can't offer the comfort. I'm not quite sure how a declivity would fit with that, but I'm not going to argue because I'm not sure what it means anyway. But that's what I found too. Other comments? Anybody else?
We are talking about Beth Ezel, right?
Yes, Beth Ezel.
My footnote says that it means house of removal. And the following line is, he will take from you its support. So the support is being removed from the house of removal.
Okay, that's a different approach than what I had found, but it may very well be right. This, I said to begin with, this is probably the hardest one for me to get a definite meaning to it.
Some of these Hebrew words that aren't used often are really hard to define.
Right.
Different guesses as to what they mean.
Right, right. But again, the point is clear. There's going to be punishment. People are going to go into captivity. and they're going to suffer for their sins, even if we don't, in our language today, get the exact import of the meaning of the names. Other comments through 11. Okay, verse 12, the inhabitant of Maroth pined for good. So what did you find about Maroth? And of course, I might like me pronouncing some of these right. What did you find about Maroth? Terry?
Means bitterness.
Bitterness. Okay, and that's what I found too. And so, what's going to happen? As you say that to them in verse 12.
They were looking for good, but disaster was going to come.
Okay, so inhabitant of Maroth pined for good, but disaster came from the Lord to the gate of Jerusalem. So their name means bitter. So they're really what they wanted. They didn't want bitterness, but that's what they're going to get. They're going to receive bitterness, disaster from the Lord, even to the gate of Jerusalem. Now, just as a matter of interest, why does he say only to the gate of Jerusalem? Why not the whole city? What happened when the Assyrians came?
The Assyrians could not get in.
Okay.
The Babylon would, but the Assyrians.
Okay, right. So, the destruction of the northern nation, Israel, they fell to Assyria. When they fell to Assyria, the Assyrians would continue to come into Judah, and these various cities would suffer the coming of the Assyrians. They would come to the gate of Jerusalem. They would just wipe out many of the other cities, but not Jerusalem, because you remember the story, which we've talked about in the time of Hezekiah. Because Hezekiah prayed and the people trusted in God, God defended them, and 185,000 of the Assyrians were slain, and the Assyrian army had to return to Assyria. So that's, I think, what he's saying here is there's going to be this disaster that many of the cities are going to suffer. It will approach Jerusalem, but they won't take Jerusalem, in contrast to the other cities. Okay? Other comments through verse 12. And now verse 13 we have Lachish, which is going to be, at least I think, one of the more interesting ones in the list. So what do you have about Lachish? But find the meaning for Lachish and the application. Velma.
What I found was obstinate. Obstinate.
Obstinate. Okay. Well, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you. It's not what I found, but
You have a chariot
yes.
bound to a swift beast, so that would be difficult to charge anyone with.
Okay, I got the chariot part too. I also got that. Other comments? Anybody else have? Terry.
I found he who walks or exists of himself. Himself.
Okay. Which would go along with obstinate. It was existing of himself. Okay. All right. I had the harness, the chariot. That what I found was that Lachish means chariot or horses, and so you harness the chariot to the swift deeds, swift steeds, because there's going to be war. That would really fit with the obstinate too. But what does he say about Lachish in verse 13? He adds more than some of the others. What is unusual about what he says about it? He says, harness the chariot to swift deeds, but what does he add to that? What more do we learn about it? Karen?
She was the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion.
Beginning of sin, the transgressions of Israel were found in you. Now, I'm not sure that I can prove this, but what I took that to mean was that Lachish was one of the first cities in Judah to accept the idolatry of Israel, to participate in the sin. And so, what's wrong with going along with the obstinate part, if you want to look at that? And so, especially, God is going to see to it that there's going to be punishment with Lachish. Other comments on Lachish? Rick?
When Kings, 2 Kings 18, 14 to 17, 2 Chronicles chapter 11, 5 through 9, says it was one of the first cities to turn corrupt under Jeroboam.
Okay? Okay, thank you. Now, one of the things that's especially interesting about Lachish, this is probably the most interesting one on the list, at least to me, is we know a lot about this city. We know a lot about the destruction of the city at the hands of the Assyrians. And it's mentioned in some of these other passages. Rick has already alluded to them, but let me read something to you from the Archaeology Study Bible, and then I will show you some slides that illustrate it. It says about the siege of Lachish. When the Assyrians attacked, Lachish was one of the main cities that they destroyed. It says it is attested in the written accounts from the Bible and Assyria, and in archaeological remains from both Israel and Assyria. Excavations at Lachish have revealed dramatic evidence of the Assyrian siege. For example, evidence shows that the entire city was consumed by fire. Another important archaeological discovery at Lachish was the remains of the only known existing Assyrian siege ramp in Israel. Listen now, following his campaign of 701 BC, Sennacherib completed a new palace in Nineveh and decorated one room with reliefs portraying the conquest of Lachish, thus preserving a dramatic visual record of the event. These reliefs show the city walls and gates, scores of attacking and defending troops with their armor and weaponry, the siege ramp, battering rams, 7 siege engines, the chaos of full-scale attack. And here's a picture of it. Well, okay, this is the location of Lachish. You see it's southwest of Jerusalem. And here is the this relief that they found. Now, I don't know how well you can see that, but you got horses at the bottom and soldiers and so on. And it's a portrayal on the wall of this room in the palace of the king of Assyria, of his conquest of Lachish, the very place that we're studying about here, and as Rick pointed out in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, is confirmed by archaeology in Assyrian records in the palace of this king. And then it says, the aftermath of the battle, including plunder and the exile of survivors, as the Assyrian king sits on a lounge chair and watches the booty of Lachish pass by. And here's this part of it, which again you may not be able to see all that well. Let me see if I can give you a little bit more help here. So here's the king over here sitting in his chair, and here are the people that have been captured coming and bowing down to him and bringing him spoils and so on. So here's this picture the king has put on the walls of this room depicting the victory that he and his army had over Lachish in fulfillment of prophecy, and specifically the city that we're talking about here in verse 13. Other comments anybody has on just that's interesting. To me, that's interesting. I hope that's helpful. Other comments? Okay, we'll continue then. The next one in verse 14 was Moresheth Gath. What do we know about Moresheth Gath, by the way? We know something about it. Velma.
Possibly where Micah.
Yeah, that's where Micah's hometown. Okay, so then he says, you shall give presents to Moresheth Gath. So what does that have to do with the name of the city? Why does he say giving presents to them? Comments on that? Susan?
I don't know about the name of the city, but these gifts supposedly are parting gifts, or something you do when you send somebody away. As the thought I found was that they were renouncing all claim to it because it would be given over to their enemies.
Okay. Other comments? What I found was that Moresheth Gath means possession of Gath, belonging to Gath. But again, the meaning that I found, the New American Standard says you give a parting gift to Moresheth Gath. So the idea seems to be that the city would be captured and her possessions would be given to others and so on. Again, the application, the significance of all of it is they're going to captivity. All these different places all these cities and the plays on words that are being made and so on, they're going to go into captivity. That's the point. Other comments on Moresheth Gath? Okay, the last part of verse 14, we have the houses of Achzib shall be a lie to the kings of Israel. This was a harder one too for me. Other comments on Achzib? Anybody? Terry?
A lie?
Okay, that's what I found as a meaning too, a deceit or a lie. Okay, so in what sense is he making an application here to Achzib? Anybody?
Maybe some of them thought they would be impenetrable.
Say it again.
Therefore, safe to go there, and that would be a lie.
Okay, yeah. It says the house of Achzib shall be a lie to the kings of Israel. So in some way they deceived the kings, either implying that they would be safe or that they wouldn't fall, that they would not be captured by the enemy. But that's not true. They're going to fall. They're going to be captured by the enemy. Velma.
One thing I found about that is that it was the most northern limit of Israel after the captivity. So it was far away, and maybe that's why they thought they could flee to there.
Okay, so demonstrating that's a long, big area that's going to go into captivity. Okay? All right. And the next verse. I'm bringing an heir to you, O inhabitant of Mareshah. Okay, bringing an heir to you, inhabitant of Mareshah, verse 15. Comments on that one? Mareshah means a character.
Inheritance.
Means an inheritance. Okay, that's what I found too. So, the city, rather than having an inheritance, they would become an inheritance to the enemy. They would become a possession to the enemy rather than themselves keeping their inheritance. Okay, that's what I got from it. Other comments on Mareshah? All right, then you've got Adullam. Okay. Adullam, what do you mean? Find on that, Terry?
A resting place?
A resting place. Okay, other comments? Is that you had, Susie?
Well, there again, I didn't have the exact meaning of the word, but the glory of Israel said their heir. Oh, the glory of Israel shall. Oh, the glory of Israel, or the heir, shall come to Adullam, therefore their glory would be gone, because the heir, Assyria, would be coming and inheriting their glory.
Okay, we do know something about Adullam in other scriptures. What else do we know about Adullam? Where else is it mentioned in Scripture? What is the context of another reference to it? Anybody?
I found that it was fortified by Rehoboam.
That's it.
Okay,
The place of antiquity.
okay. I missed that one. Okay, it was one of the places where David hid, the cave of Adullam, when he was fleeing from Saul. So that would fit, you see, then the idea here that being the glory of Israel will come to Adullam. They're going to hide, going to try to escape, but they won't be able to escape. But the idea, again, of all of it is, again, obviously, I'm not sure about all of this, but some of it maybe. But in any case, the main thing that we can be sure of is what he's saying is they're going to go into captivity. They're in sin, and God's going to bring punishment because of their evil. That's the point of all of this, all these different towns and so forth. Other comments? Anybody? All right, verse 16, then, how does he describe the application to the people? Question number 19, which is obviously verse 16, not verse 19 as I had it. Well, how would the people react? Verse 16, how would they react to all this? Rick?
Well, he wants them to cut off all their hair and enlarge their baldness because their children are going to go into captivity. The following generations are going to pay for their sins also. It's just not going to stop at this.
Okay, yes, I I'm not, so the baldness, cutting off the hair, those are symbols of grief. Even says like the baldness of an eagle. That should ring a bell with us in America, the bald eagle. But they will go into captivity, he said. So there, in other words, the grief. And that's the lesson of all of this. That pretty much is a summary of all these verses we've been reading. There's going to be grief, there's going to be sorrow, even your children. Future generations are going to suffer because of what you've done. You're going to go into captivity. Okay? Other comments through verse 16 and anything on chapter 1, anybody, before we move on? Okay, we went through that relatively rapidly, but I hope at least we got the main point, the punishment that's coming. Anything else before we go into chapter 2, anybody? Well, let's move on to chapter 2 then. In this chapter we have God is going to present his case against a certain group of people. So I ask you in verse 1, well, we need to read it first. Let's do some reading. Chapter 2, who'd like to read? Let's read the first 4 verses at least. We'd like to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 for us, please. Bill, please. Chapter 2, verse 1 through 4.
Woe to those who devise iniquity and work out evil on their beds. At morning light they practice it, because it is the power of their hand. They covet fields and take them by violence, also houses and seize them. So they oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. Therefore thus says the Lord, behold, against this family I am devising the disaster from which you cannot remove your necks, nor shall you walk humbly, for this is an evil time. In that day one shall take up a proverb against you, and lament with a bitter lamentation, saying, we are utterly destroyed. He has changed the heritage of my people. How he has removed it from me to a turncoat. He has divided our fields.
Okay. So Micah takes a significantly different direction now, not talking about the cities anymore, but he's talking about the errors of a certain group of people, or a certain kind of people in the land. So I ask you, based on what we've read, question number 1, what kind of people is he talking about here? Pronouncing a woe on what kind of people, would you say, Karen?
Well, it's people who have power over others, because at the end of verse 1 he says, because it is in the power of their hand.
Okay, so we're talking about people who have power over others. Those somehow leaders, either political power or financial, they're wealthy, but they have the power to do harm to other people. Okay? So what are some of the things, well, let's start with verse 1 before we get into the specifics. How does he describe them in their evil? Verse 1. How does he describe it? What does he say about it? Frank?
When they devise iniquity while they're lying on their bed, like at night, devising evil, making plans for evil to commit these evil plans against their neighbor.
Okay, we would say they lay awake at night thinking of bad things to do. And that's what it seems to me like he's talking about. That they and even at night, not the things that they do to other people aren't just happening accidentally or on the spur of the moment. They are deliberately, we would call it malice aforethought. They've plotted it, they've planned it, and then they carry it out because they have the power to do so, to mistreat other people. Comments? Susie.
Genesis 6:5 made me think of when God destroyed the earth. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thought of their hearts was evil continually.
Yeah. Genesis 6, yeah, the time of Noah's flood. Does he, on the other hand, Danny?
I was going to say, this is a priority for them because this is the first thing that they do in the day. They think about it and they plan it, and then, as soon as the day comes, that's the thing that they're going to do right away. So wickedness is a big thing for them, trying to accomplish.
Okay, so they make their plans at night. First thing in the morning, they get up and they go out and they do it. Okay? Comments? Still, I guess, on question 1, chapter 2, question 1. I don't know about you, but this sure reminds me of a lot of people today. It just seems like that we've got people, and a lot of them are in power, and just like it describes here, positions of power. It just, all the wicked stuff they do, it seems like they must lay awake at night, thinking of bad stuff to do. It's just incredible. Some of this stuff, and how quickly they can bring about evil in a society. It sure sounds like what we're talking about here. Okay? Other comments on verse 1? Anybody? All right, so I did ask you question number 2. What are some other passages about people who plot evil? Steve.
In 2 Samuel 11, 14 and 15, talks about David arranging the death of Uriah. In the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, set Uriah in forefront of the house of battle, and retreat from him, that he may be struck down and die.
All right, so there you have an example of what we're talking about. A man who had power, David, who should have been, was supposedly a man after God's own heart, but he wanted a man's wife, committed adultery with her, and eventually had her husband killed so he could have her. He had the power to do it, and so he carried out his plan, plotting evil. Okay? Other examples, other passages anybody has? Anybody else? Steve?
Terry.
Okay, Terry.
Proverbs 1:11 through 14, 10. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive and whole, and like those who go down to the pit, we shall find all precious goods, and we shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot among us, and we will all have one person. So do not walk in the way with them.
Okay, so that's an example where Solomon is giving advice to his son to stay away from people like this. That there are people who will plot evil, plan how to steal from other people, how to mistreat other people, take other people's property. And his message to his son is, stay away from those kind of people. Don't participate, and don't be a party to that kind of thing. Okay? Anybody have another passage? There's lots of them, of course. Bill, and then we'll move on.
Hosea 7, verse 6 and 7. They prepare their hearts like an oven while they lie in wait. The baker sleeps all night. In the morning it burns like a flaming fire. They are all hot like an oven and have devoured their judges. All their kings have fallen. Among them calls upon me.
All right, so we studied it in the book of Hosea, didn't we? And we'll see it in lots of other of the minor prophets. It's a common theme. People with power, wealth, and political power and so on, oppressing those who are subject to them, or people who they think they can get away with it because it's in the power of their hand. Okay? We'll see lots of other examples as we go through the prophets. Okay? So then verse 2, specific. Here's some specifics in verse 2. What in particular do they do? What in particular do they try to take or obtain from them? Karen?
Well, they take private property, fields and houses by violence.
Right, so they take other people's property. Fields, houses, seize them. They oppress a man in his house, a man in his inheritance. Okay, so here's one thing that they do. They have the power to take other people's property. Why does he talk about the man's inheritance? Did you think about that? It talks about a man and his inheritance. Why does it mention that? Thoughts on that? Terry?
Well, the land was their inheritance, and they weren't to sell it. They weren't to give it away.
Okay, that was very, very important to the people of Israel, wasn't it? When they went into the land, they conquered the land, they divided it up. and each man got an inheritance. And that was his family, and that was to be passed on from generation to generation. But these people didn't care about other people's inheritance or their right to the property that had been given to them by God. If they could take it, they would take it because they had the power to take it. And that reminded me of another story, too, of someone who did that kind of thing. Any of you think of any particular example of that? Ahab taking Naboth's vineyard. Okay, and that's exactly what happened. Exactly as described here, 1 Kings chapter 21. He was a king. He wanted Naboth's vineyard. It was Naboth's inheritance. He didn't want to give it up. And so his wife Jezebel had Naboth killed. Okay, other comments on the first couple of verses? Anybody? Karen?
Dictators throughout history, some living today, they just, if they're evil enough, they just pass laws that say, well, I have the right to do this, and they just take people's property. It happens today.
Okay, and we talked about communism, Marxism. That's part of their plan. Take people's property. They don't care about your property rights, about that you bought that property or you inherited that property. They take it because they think that's what the government ought to do, and because they think they have the power. So these kinds of things this is written about people many, many centuries ago, but in many ways it's very much up to date. Our society has people just like this today, and other societies as well. Okay, we'll take up in verse 3 then. Any other comments before we close? Okay, thank you very much.